SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello students, we will continue our presentation on the work or the impact of Western architects in India, and we are looking at the contribution of Walter Gropius. This is part 2. Bauhaus and its influence on contemporary Indian architecture. This is the logo, so to speak, of Bauhaus, and this is the Central Building Research Institute CBRI, IIT Roorkee, designed by A.P. Kanbinde. Now the contribution in Bauhaus has been in two parts, in architecture and education. The education that you are receiving as students of architecture is predominantly based on the Bauhaus model. The visual clarity and boldness of expression of modernism captured the imagination of Indian architects. In the last presentation on Walter Gropius, I talked about the design of the Bauhaus school by Walter Gropius and then the design of the curricular structure of the Bauhaus school, which then got global presence. It has a global presence, and the architecture of the Bauhaus itself then has a global presence. But like I mentioned last time, we cannot look at the design of Bauhaus as an isolated example of modernism. There is a range of architects and their buildings that form the composite picture of modernism. So there is Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, the D-style architects like Rietveld, and then Adolf Loos, and then ahead many architects like Richard Neutra, Marcel Breuer, Alvar Aalto, Eero Saarinen, and many others, and then it is continued onwards into late modernism and so on. So the picture that emerges in front of us is not one architect but several architects contributing. This presentation is focusing on the contribution of Walter Gropius and Bauhaus. So the modernist leaning architects in India owe much to their forms, to the works of Bauhaus and Corbusier, or I would say Walter Gropius and Corbusier, primarily because Corbusier came to work in India. When he designed Chandigarh, he designed several projects in Ahmedabad, and Walter Gropius made his presence felt through the works of two prominent architects, Habib Rahman and A.P. Kanbinde, the first generation of modernist architects in India. Louis Kahn also made his presence felt, and he was able to do that through one building, the IIM Ahmedabad, and architects like Doshi were able to bring his ideas into their work, and many others also followed in the works that they did. So when we look at the contribution of Western architects post independence in India, we generally focus on these three, and this is the second one we are focusing on, and in the next presentation we will look at Louis Kahn. Now young Indian architects were inspired by this new architecture of simple, solid, unornamented blocks, clean structural system, and large fenestrations. It is free from historical and colonial past. This is very important. All this while, Indian architects were looking for a style or a concept of architecture that would break them away from the historical past and the colonial past. Now this is parallel to what the Europeans had pursued. Right after the Industrial Revolution, we see the neoclassical movement in the 18th century. Just before Industrial Revolution, we see it came to be known as the age of the intellectual revolution, or the age of the intellectual, or the age of enlightenment, 18th century. Industrial Revolution happens, and industrial progress begins, mass production begins, etc., etc. Large number of buildings are required in Europe for variety of functions to be fulfilled, but the architects are in a predicament that they are in a kind of a confusion, because they do not have any precedents to these buildings. They have never seen what a railway station looks like, or many of the buildings look like, or what a modern office buildings looks like. They haven't seen that. So they don't have a form equivalent in the past, and in order to get those forms they refer back to Renaissance, to Gothic architecture, to classical architecture, and they adopt these old movements to modern buildings. Now this of course leads to a disconnect, because the modern building, for example, cannot fit in the envelope of a Greek temple, because functionally the modern building is organized asymmetrically, and therefore the form does not work. So then classically minded architects of the time, they decided that we can just adopt the principles. Then it gave rise to what came to be known as eclecticism, which was probably the most dominant way of designing buildings at the time. Eclecticism, the word eclectic means a mixture, in this case a mixture of historical styles. So one building, for example the St. Pancras station in London, is a mixture or an eclectic collection, eclectic mix of Renaissance, classical architecture, etc. But on the inside, the train shed itself, the shed over the railway tracks is made out of iron, and it is got glass in it to let light filter in, and that is completely technical and a modern material. And steel production jumped in Europe from 800,000 tons to 40 million tons by the end of the century. Steel production improved both in quality and quantity, and large number of buildings began to be built in steel. RCC also came up, what was called as ferroconcrete, steel and concrete put together, utilizing the properties of both steel and concrete. These materials brought about a fundamental shift in architecture, and building design changed because functional requirements were different. But architects kept on struggling with the aesthetic or the form of the building. Therefore, when Art Nouveau came up, the desire was, how can we completely break away from the past styles? We want a completely new building, a modern looking building for the modern times. Because they could not find the right inspiration, and because you do need an inspiration, they looked towards the only other alternative they had to the past styles, and that was nature. Therefore, Art Nouveau relied heavily on natural forms. Biomorphic, zoomorphic forms came up in buildings. Classically, let's to take a classic example or an extreme example of such is that the works of Antoni Gaudi. Then also came up mechanomorphic, forms that are morphed from machines or that are more rational, mechanical looking, and we find that in the works of C.R. Mackintosh. And these works of C.R. Mackintosh and then Joseph Hoffmann, Otto Wagner, even to a certain extent Joseph Marie Olbrich, they gave us a foreshadow of what was to come in the modern times. They became like the space occupied in between the end of Art Nouveau and the beginning of the modern movement. These works represent the second part of Art Nouveau, the works of C.R. Mackintosh and Joseph Hoffmann, etc. And then as we move on from 1910 onwards, we are into the modern movement. I believe the modern movement in architecture is the single most revolutionary movement in architecture, at least in the modern times, in the post-industrial times, if not I would say comparable to the impact of classical architecture, because they radically transformed what buildings look like, completely detached from the look of the buildings that had very clear evidence of historical forms. These buildings were completely different, and these buildings were really connected with the structure and function of the modern building. It was a truly modern building. So the contribution of these architects and modernism can never be understated. Therefore, India had the fortune that we did not have to go through these steps, in the sense that the day we became independent, by that time modernism had already taken deep roots in Europe, and when Indian architects who went to study abroad, or even when they looked at the work of the Western architects while they were in India, for example, we looked at the work of Architects United in Pune, they could directly develop their works from there. They did not have to go back again to some historical process and then learn from the mistakes or the problems there and then move on. They directly had a modern format to build from, and this was the architecture of these simple, solid, unornamented blocks with clean structural systems, wonderful functional organization, and large fenestrations free from historical and colonial past. Modernist architecture also gave India the aesthetically simple designs, point skyscrapers and slab blocks. For example, these buildings. This is the Air India building in Mumbai, the earlier Air India building. This is the Trident Hotel of the Oberoi chain, and this I believe is a residential building. So these buildings along the Marine Drive, where we see the use of flat roofs and simple horizontal lines and fenestrations, show clearly that Indian architects were informed about the concepts that were evolving in European modernist architecture. Of course, these buildings were adapted for Indian situations, and as I have said earlier, climate is one of the defining factors of the way our buildings look. Modernist buildings in India being built parallelly to the modernist buildings in Europe and America, particularly skyscrapers in America. For example, when I am talking of point blocks, they were sleek glass skyscrapers there. The same architect who were working there, for example, the building they designed in India, they would adapt it to our climatic conditions. Gropius's link with India was through AP Kanwinde and Habib Rahman, and that was because Habib Rahman studied under Gropius at MIT, Kanwinde studied under him in Harvard. How can one man be in two places? Gropius was teaching in Harvard and he also was taking lectures in MIT. Therefore, both of them got an opportunity to study under him. They brought Bauhaus into India and in fact surpassed Corbusier in bringing modernism into mainstream Indian architecture of the period with which their projects are related. Again, looking back to the middle class works of Architects United in Pune, for example. Yes, those works are connected with modernism in general, and in some ways also connected with Corbusier, because it is so difficult to differentiate where the contribution of one modernist architect ends and the other one begins, but definitely there is a very strong impact of this functional organization of the Bauhaus and Walter Gropius. So therefore, mainstream Indian architecture probably owes more to Walter Gropius's works than to Corbusier. But like I said, it is very difficult to define these fine lines. Their works changed the course of India's architectural pattern of that time. The contribution, the impact of Walter Gropius's work then resulted in the buildings we have today, with a regional addition that happened in the 70s, 80s, etc. Began, for example, with works like the Gandhi Samarak Sangrahalaya, that is a modern building with regional overtones. Habib Rahman and AP Kanwinde, significant impetus to the Bauhaus movement through their works. Vast number of Bauhaus inspired buildings with rational and functional designs that were devoid of ornamentation, asymmetry, geometric forms in glass and steel and concrete, flat roofs, glass curtain walls and smooth facades came up. These are the works of Habib Rahman. This is the WHO building, and these two works are the works of AP Kanwinde, who as time went on became even more exploratory in the forms that he evolved, and so we have these amazing forms of the Dudh Sagar Dairy in Mehsana and the Nehru Science Center in Delhi. This is the Dak Tar Bhavan by Habib Rahman, and the amazing contribution of Habib Rahman that we see here, the kind of modernist buildings he brings to India, is also seen in sharper relief when we realize that he was working within the structured mechanism of CPWD. He was heading the CPWD, he never moved out of the CPWD, and while working for them he designed these amazingly iconic buildings. So the Dak Tar Bhavan, as you can see, is very strongly connected with modernism. It has got these fantastic louvers or sunbreakers. So this is the impact of the Indian climatic conditions. Then we have a series of buildings in the 60s. We have the Indraprastha Bhavan in Delhi in 1965. We have these multi-storied apartments in Arkipuram in 1965. We have the Curzon Road Hostel in near Connaught Place in 1967, and the WHO building in 1963. So these are the 60s contribution of Habib Rahman. Having stepped off the boat from America, he designs these buildings that are so strongly connected with Bauhaus and Walter Gropius. Then we have the contributions of Kanvinde, which are probably somewhat earlier than that. We have the now the reason why these buildings are appearing in the 60s in Delhi is because before this Habib Rahman was working with the Calcutta Public Works Department, and he designed a very important building which set off his journey, and that is the Secretariat building. We will look at that. Whereas Kanvinde began, and he was the consulting architect with the CSIR, and he designed the CSIR labs. He designed the National Botanical Research Institute Lucknow in 1953 to 54, the Toxology Research Center again in Lucknow in 1969 to 70. He designed the CBRI in Roorkee in 1951. He designed the Physical Research Laboratory in Ahmedabad in 1953 to 54. Bauhaus was integrated as time went on. It got integrated with India's cultural and climatic factors. Things could never move forward in India purely as modernism. What I mean by that is that they did come in as purely modernist buildings in the works of Rahman and Kanvinde, but the language of culture and climate of India was added on to it. So this happened in the works of Habib Rahman to very large extent. In a contrasting way, it did not happen in the works of A.P. Kanvinde. A.P. Kanvinde stands out as one architect whose buildings had very limited connect with any traditional Indian elements. In fact, to a larger degree, none at all. We do find a very strong connect in the works of Stein and Korea and Doshi, etc. And we also find it in the works of Habib Rahman as his work evolves. For example, Rahman's work of the Mazar of Maulana Azad and the Mazar of Zakir Hussain in Delhi, addition of Indian architectural elements like jalis, arches and domes to the original Bahausian palette. So when you look at these mazars, yes, they are derived from Islamic traditions, but they are an addition to the Bahausian palette. We also find jali work, for example, in the Lalit Kala Academy, which at that time was a modern derivation of the Indian jali. Of course, when we look at the 21st century, the traditional jalis have been used by many young Indian architects today in a much more scientific way, and we look at those examples. Now in the 50s, they were dominated by these two visionary architects, Habib Rahman and Kanvinde, and the Bauhaus influence, for example, is seen in the Atira building, the Ahmedabad Textile Industries Research Association building designed by Kanvinde, and the Secretariat building designed by Rahman in Kolkata. The new Secretariat building in Kolkata by Habib Rahman 1949 to 54 shows the significant new way of thinking in rationalism. Rahman, having returned to India, said that he was full of Gropius, Oscar Niemeyer and Brazil. He said that in 1988, and in this 15-story modernist building that he designed is a great clarity of form coming from Bauhaus, combination of geometric forms with vertical and horizontal lines. You can see the vertical mass. In fact, the vertical mass is accentuated by these vertical lines of the louvers on this side. This is that facade where you see these vertical louvers, and this verticality is accentuated by a series of vertical lines here, and then you have this part of the building where you have these deep louvers or sunbreakers or brise soleil like that of Corbusier. So this part of the work refers back to Corbusier. Now these brise soleil protect the sun from the south facade. So therefore Indian climate, immediately the presence of the Indian climate is felt as soon as they start designing these buildings in India. Now the UGC building in Delhi, the University Grants Commission building in 1954, the building on the right that you see here is the Comptroller and Auditor General building designed in 1958. So this set of two amazing buildings in the modernist Bauhaus category. So the Bauhaus ideology and building forms is a box shape in the overall form, and it is designed in a functionalist manner. Now with regard to the site function and climatic response, the entire building, the UGC building, is divided up into two wings to fit into the site, and it has covered parking. The parking is provided by raising the building on a pilotis, and the functional part that we see here is the service core is at the junction of these two wings of the UGC building, and then there are the sunshades and louvers provided. So this is the Indian climatic addition to the modernist building, which eliminates direct sunlight from the rooms and protects the wall storm. The summer sun reduces AC or air conditioning gain. So these ideas about thermal comfort, energy efficiency was already embedded in the modernist buildings in India at a time when they were not being talked about in such urgency as we are talking about it today. This is the idea of the functional planning. This is the Bauhaus, and you can see the pinwheel design of the Bauhaus. Like I said, I will again repeat it. This is the workshop wing, this is the technical school part, these are the administrative offices, this is the auditorium section, and these are the student hostel, the dormitory. All the functional parts are distinct from each other, but they are integrated together to work together, as I mentioned last time, like the organs of the human body, or like you see in a printed circuit or a circuit board in which all the chips are connected to work together. So now the idea of the functional organization came in CBRI by Kanwinde. As you can see, this is the aerial view, this is the CBRI compound, and here this particular wing, and this is where we enter the building, and this wing at the back where the architects studios, offices are there on the ground level, and then behind it are the other parts which have different research labs of the CBRI. Now then there is another building which is on our campus, it is called the Khosla International House of KIH, designed by Kanwinde, and it has got these two wings very similar to what Rahman had done in the UGC building, having these two wings, but instead of those wings being diagonal to each other or coming at an angle, these two buildings are both in a sense parallel to each other, and they are connected here by the entrance wing. And again this is a functional organization of building as in Bauhaus. Now the Atira building 1950 to 52, again Gropius design philosophy so clearly evident in its application here. The functional areas are separate yet linked, there is a purity of form vis-a-vis Bauhaus. The purity of form here I am referring to is basically with regard to the design of the Bauhaus itself, particularly the workshop wing, and both use newly developed building technologies. Space planning is it's open, zoned out into different activity areas, administration cum lab component, all of them are functionally organized in a rectangular form. There is climate protection with sunshades provided on the south facade, running the full course of the building in continuous lines. On the north facade, where the sunshades are not required, the fenestrations are flush with the outside wall. Now therefore the difference we find because of the climate, this building is becomes more introvert because of the climate, and therefore it cannot afford to provide such extensive curtain wall that we see in Bauhaus, because we require deep sun penetration there, whereas here we need to keep out the sun. So therefore what we have is the glass curtain wall in Bauhaus versus the masonry infill wall or masonry curtain wall with fenestrations in Atira. Both Bauhaus and the Atira building are having an RCC structural frame. The structural design, the introduction of the flexible RCC column and beam grid in India through projects like the Atira building. Now Kanwinde's architectural, structure and construction ideas were highly influential in India simply because their logic and utility was easy to understand and follow. Kanwinde's work of the time really held up very well both as an intellectual exercise and as a physical exercise in functional planning of the building, whether it is the PRL. Now this is the PRL, all three of them are views of the Physical Research Laboratory in Ahmedabad. But let us come to a building which is the only example that I have found where there is some kind of connection with some traditional Indian element, and that is the Azad Bhavan in New Delhi from 58 to 61. Now in this building, the client's desire was to Indianize the work, and therefore what is said by critics is that this turned out to be a superficial treatment which is not very well integrated, and it is not a much remembered work of Kanvinde. Now what is the traditional feature? This dome that you see at the entrance, this that you see here, this jali work, and then you find this dome, and then a kind of a hierarchical fashion. The similar domical structure is there as sunshades over these windows, and then you have this as a cantilever at the entrance of the building. So this element is the Indianization of the building. Had Kanvinde done it as he had done the Etira building or the PRL, etc., this element wouldn't have been there. It wouldn't have been there as sunshades over the windows, and the building would have been a straight up example of Bauhaus. But Indianization of Azad Bhavan to me does give it a unique identity amongst the early works of Kanvinde. In fact, to be very honest with you, I have appreciated or I have liked the Azad Bhavan the most amongst the early, at least in the form, in the appearance, amongst the early works of Kanvinde. But that is my personal opinion. You must form your own opinions with regard to these works. But here is an interesting exercise. This is the Azad Bhavan, and you can see very clearly this kind of the connect between the dome, the sunshades, and the entrance cantilever. Now watch carefully. I am comparing it to several buildings on our campus designed by Mr. Kanvinde, and that is the Civil Engineering Department. Now look at this building carefully, and you will find that this has the same cantilever that you find here in the Azad Bhavan. Now look at another building which is just behind the Civil Engineering Department, it is the Mechanical Department, and you find it's also got this kind of a cantilevered entrance here. So the cantilever entrance turns out to be the form element of the building that dominates the entrance of these buildings. We again find this kind of cantilevered entrance in Khosla International House designed by Kanvinde. There are other buildings on the campus not designed by him, but that follow a similar format. For example, the Chemical Engineering Department also has such kind of a cantilevered entrance. This became a repetitive model, and we find that here in these buildings. Then let us come to a different example by a different set of architects. This is the Oberoi Hotel in New Delhi by Durga Bajpai and Pilu Modi in 1958. Now here John Lang says that the international style has been propagated, rather Oberoi Hotel represents the international style propagated by Walter Gropius. But when I look at this building, I am also reminded of the form of Unity habitation. This is Unity habitation, and in fact even the roofscape, that is the roof garden of Unity habitation, finds its resonance in the Oberoi Hotel, where you have these facilities right at the top of the hotel, and then of course there is the block of the Bauhaus, which also is evident in the Oberoi Hotel in its block form. So not only is this building a reminder of the international style of Walter Gropius, it is also a reminder of the modernist brutalism or rather the international style of Le Corbusier. But this is so different from Ashok Hotel that just came up 3 years earlier, and this is the difference. I told you that this designed by E.B. Doctor has a modernist facade, but it is been covered with traditional Indian elements like the jharoka, the chhatri, the jali, the brackets. This on the other hand, the Oberoi Hotel, is devoid of this kind of traditional Indian elements. It is upfront a modernist clean cut example. Of course it is having the elements of the shading devices etc. for the climatic conditions, and then let us compare it with United Habitation and the Bauhaus. So, the form of the Ashok Hotel, also the block arrangement is very similar to other modernist buildings, but it is overshadowed on the outside by these traditional Indian elements. Then there is the Rabindra Bhavan in Delhi, where Habib Rahman started evolving a different vocabulary, a little away, moving away from the Bauhaus. The Rabindra Bhavan houses the Sangeet Natak Academy, the Lalit Kala Academy and the Sahitya Academy. This shows Rahman's own architectural development, which is a breakaway from direct repetition of the Bauhaus thinking. This has 3 wings connected by one common area from where these 3 wings move outwards. So, free flowing form with a continuous chhajja or sunshade, and there are the abstract jalis we look at. So, when you look at this facade, for example, where you have these continuous sunshades, this facade represents looking at the building from this side, and when you look at this facade and you see this corridor, which is this one here, and you are looking at the building from this side. Now, another building that came up in 1932, one of the very important works of Alvar Aalto, was the Pioneer Sanatorium in Finland. It is a very clear cut example of international style, but the important point I want to make is this one. There is a Bauhausian concept in the functional organization of Pioneer Sanatorium that is also reflected in Rabindra Bhavan. Now, what you find here in the Pioneer Sanatorium is that every segment, every part of the building corresponds to a different function, just as in Bauhaus, just as in the Rabindra Bhavan and the Lalit Kala Academy. These 3 wings have different parts of the Rabindra Bhavan, and this is the Lalit Kala Academy. Now, the overall form of the Rabindra Bhavan is a stretched pentagonal plan following the curves of the traffic circle. Let us look at it. So, we have the larger pentagon, and this is running parallel to the road network, and then there is a larger pentagon being formed on the outer periphery. Now, the Lalit Kala Academy, this is the design which in itself is a pentagon. So, what we have here is that you have this inner pentagon, and there is another inner pentagon to this one, and then you have the larger pentagon on the periphery. Now, this exhibition galleries, the Lalit Kala Academy, have the windows shielded by these jalis that provide glare free light in the interiors. So, this is what the interior looks like of the Lalit Kala Academy, with these circular columns or pilotis, and this is a double height facade with these diffuse light filtering into the building, and it is so similar, strikingly similar to the entrance of the Pioneer Sanatorium, which again has circular column, freestanding circular columns or pilotis. I will end here, and this shows you in a very summarized manner the relationship or the contribution of Walter Gropius and Bauhaus to modern Indian growth of modern Indian architecture, the works particularly of Habib Rahman and A.P. Kanvinde. Starting from next session, we will look at the work of Louis Kahn and his contribution to modern Indian architecture. Thank you.